I was thunderstruck. As you may well imagine, not Goliath. What could it possibly mean to be not Goliath? It didn't occur to me to say, well, if I'm not Goliath, then who am I? A human would ask this question, because he would know that, whatever his name, he is assuredly someone. I did not. On the contrary, it seemed to me that if I was not Goliath, then I must be no one at all. Though the stranger had never laid eyes on me before that day, I didn't doubt for a moment that he spoke with an unquestionable authority. 1,000 others had called me by the name of Goliath, even those who, like the workers at the menagerie, knew me well. But that was clearly not the point, counted for nothing. The stranger hadn't said, your name is not Goliath. He had said, you are not Goliath. There was a world of difference as I felt it, though I could not have expressed it this way at the same time. My awareness of selfhood had been pronounced a delusion. I drifted into a sort of fugue state, neither aware nor unconscious. An attendant came round with food, but I ignored him. Night fell, but I didn't sleep. The rain stopped, and the sun rose without my noticing. Soon there were the usual crowds of visitors calling out, Goliath, Goliath, Goliath. But I paid no attention. Several days passed in this way. Then, one evening, after the menagerie had closed for the day, I took a long drink from my bowl and soon fell asleep. A powerful sedative had been added to my water. At dawn, I awoke in an unfamiliar cage. At first, because it was so large and so strangely shaped, I didn't even recognize it as a cage. In fact, it was circular and open to the air on all sides. As I later understood, a gazebo had been modified to serve the purpose, except for a large white house nearby. It stood alone in the midst of an attractive park that I imagined must extend to the ends of the earth. It was not long before I'd conceived an explanation for this strange translocation. The people who visited the menagerie came, at least in part, with the expectation of seeing a gorilla named Goliath. How they came to have this expectation I could not guess, but they certainly seemed to have it. And when the owner of the menagerie learned that I was, in fact, not Goliath, he could scarcely go on exhibiting me as such, and so had no real choice but to send me away. I didn't know whether to be sorry about this or not. My new home was far more pleasant than anything I had seen since leaving Africa, but without the daily stimulation of the crowds, it would soon be even more excruciatingly boring than the zoo, where at least I had had the company of other gorillas. I was still pondering these matters when, around mid-morning, I looked up and saw that I was not alone. A man was standing just beyond the bars, blackly silhouetted against the sunlit house in the distance. I approached cautiously and was astonished to recognize him. As if reenacting our former encounter, we gazed into each other's eyes for several minutes. I sitting on the floor of my cage, he leaning on his walking stick. I saw that, dry and freshly dressed, he was not the elderly person I had first taken him for. His face was long and dark and bony, his eyes burned with a strange intensity, and his mouth seemed set in an expression of bitter mirth. At last he nodded, exactly as before, and said, "Yes, I was right. You are not Goliath, you are Ishmael." Once again, as if everything that mattered was now finally settled, he turned and walked away. And once again, I was thunderstruck, but this time by feeling a profound relief, for I had been redeemed from oblivion. More, the error that caused me to live as an unwitting impostor for so many years had been corrected at last. I had been made whole as a person, not again, but for the very first time. I was consumed with curiosity about my Savior. I didn't think to associate him with my removal from the menagerie to this charming belvedere, for I was as yet incapable of even that most primitive of fallacies, post hoc ergo propter hoc. He was to me a supernal being. To a mind ready for mythology, he was the beginning of what is meant by godlike. He had twice made a brief appearance in my life, and twice, with a single utterance, had transformed me. I tried to search for the underlying meaning of these appearances, but found only questions. Had this man come to the menagerie in search of Goliath, or in search of me? Had he come because he hoped I was Goliath, or because he suspected I was not Goliath? How had he so promptly found me in my new location? I had no measure of the extent of human information. If it was common knowledge that I could be found at the menagerie, as it had seemed to be, Was it also common knowledge that I could now be found here? Despite all these unanswerable questions, the overwhelming fact remained that this uncanny creature had twice sought me out in order to address me in an unprecedented way as a person. I was certain that having finally settled the matter of my identity, he would vanish from my life forever. What more was there for him to do? Doubtless you will have surmised that all these breathless apperceptions were just so much moonshine. Nonetheless, the truth, as I later learned it, was not much less fantastic. My benefactor was a wealthy Jewish merchant of this city, a man by the name of Walter Sokolow. On the day he discovered me at the menagerie, he'd been out walking in the rain, in a kind of suicidal gloom that had descended on him a few months before, when he learned beyond any doubt that his entire family had been swallowed up in the Nazi Holocaust. His wanderings led him to a carnival set up at the edge of town, and he went in with nothing in particular on his mind. Because of the rain, most of the booths and rides were shut down, giving the place an air of abandonment that accorded well with his melancholy. At last he came to the menagerie, whose chief attractions were advertised in a series of lurid paintings. One of these, more lurid than the rest, depicted the gorilla Goliath brandishing the broken body of an African native as if it were a weapon. Walter Sokolow, perhaps thinking that a gorilla named Goliath was an apt symbol for the Nazi giant that was then engaged in crushing the race of David, decided it would be satisfying to behold such a monster behind bars.